Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, for the Praise of Folly podcast. Today, this is episode 5 of the Lyceum Roundtable, part 2 of our series on Can Man Survive Modernity? Today, we're dealing with a Marxist critique of modernity, specifically how it relates to the economic mode of production that is quintessential to modernity, that of capitalism. And primarily two elements of that critique: the internal contradictions within capitalism itself, and the claim that capitalism puts a set of conditions upon mankind that man is unable to live with. It is so against the nature of man that some other system has to replace it. So Keith, why don't you sort of sketch this Marxist critique of capitalism for us?
Well, the Marxist critique of capitalism is ironically somewhat similar to the right-wing critique of capitalism, but the issue is that Marxism takes this critique in a much different direction. If you actually read some of Marx's most basic writings, like the Communist Manifesto, for example, one of the things that he talks about is the way in which capitalism and by extension, industrial society and modernity and all of these things have had the effect of breaking down traditional societies in the sense that the concept of noblesse oblige, the relationship between feudal lords and their peasants, and the idea of royal obligations to the ruled, and all of these kinds of things that dominated the hierarchical structures of pre-modern societies. He recognizes that capitalism has had the effect of breaking all of these things down. He thinks that that's a good thing. He sees this as revolutionary. He sees capitalism as revolutionary. In fact, in the Communist Manifesto and other writings, Marx and Engels praised capitalism for this. They said that capitalism was a historically very progressive force in this way. They also praised imperialism for this reason. At the same time, they also had a similar view of capitalism that the traditionalists from the right had, in the sense that they said, well, because of the fact that these older organic hierarchical societies have been broken down by capitalism, something has also been lost. What they were mostly concerned about was the impact of this on the working class. During the Industrial Revolution in Europe, what typically happened was that peasants would migrate from rural areas to the cities to get jobs in factories, and you had the massive growth of cities during this time. And the masses of workers in these urban industrial centers sort of became nameless, faceless, slave-like creatures that were viewed as simply being cogs in a machine. They no longer had this identity of being a part of a particular community or attached to some particular lord or something like that, as was the case in pre-modernity. Instead, you had the masses of proletarian laborers, the wage slaves, who were considered to be barely a step above chattel slaves. And Marx viewed capitalism as having had the effect of dehumanizing the workers in this particular way, and consequently, rendering the workers into these stupid, rootless, identityless creatures. Now, the Marxist idea was not to go back to traditional societies, which is more of the right-wing critique of capitalism. I mean, even among, say, the distributists, the Catholic distributists like Chesterton and people like that, there's this idea of this critique of capitalism that's actually somewhat similar to the Marxist critique, but they want to turn back the clock. They want to say, let's go back and reclaim some of these things that were lost, that were part of the pre-modern order. The Marxists say, no, that's gone forever. That's a done deal. So what we need to do is go further. We need to take the wealth and technology and productivity that has been generated by capitalism, but we need to harness it and make the process of production more rational by meeting human needs. And the only way we can do that is to do away with market relations and production based on profit and commodification, and instead have a planned economy where resources are allocated according to need through a worker state. That's the Marxist ideal. And that continues to be largely the left-wing critique of capitalism even to this day.
All right. Yeah, the point you made earlier, and one that I think Chomsky likes to bandy about, is the division of labor line. This is taken from a 1995 interview by David Barrisman, where Chomsky says everybody reads the first paragraph of The Wealth of Nations, where he talks about how wonderful the division of labor is. But how many people get to the point hundreds of pages later where he says that the division of labor will destroy human beings and turn people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human being to be. And therefore, in any civilized society, the government is going to have to take some measures to prevent division of labor from proceeding to its limits. So Swithin here is a resident ANCAP. What is your response to this Marxist critique? The internal contradictions of capitalism, the fact that it makes human beings as stupid as it is possible for us to become. Oh boy, can you hear us, Swithin? Well, I guess while we're waiting for Swithin, maybe Right Ruminations, you can answer that question.
Well, I think that the problem with Chomsky's view, and to the extent to which Smith was actually of this view, where he would be mistaken, is that I think that the reality of an educated populace depends on a certain degree of material prosperity that I don't really see being present in a pre-capitalist or any known non-capitalist society. And it seems to me that the division of labor being a prerequisite for the degree of prosperity that has always been the precondition for any kind of sophisticated, say, first world society, really links in an indirect way the education of the people who are supposedly being driven into ignorance by the division of labor. So, for example, yes, a division of labor is required to have something like YouTube or Amazon.com, but by the same token, these things allow all of us to have access to, say, to say the Communist Manifesto or the Wealth of Nations or just about anything you could name for free at the click of the button. All you have to do is just find an audio book of it. And so in that way, the idea that capitalism has coincided with a reduction of the kind of knowledge reserves of the average person, I don't think is true. And I think it's a rather rosy view of the past. As idiotic as modern man may seem from time to time, you have to take into account things like the Flynn effect, where the average IQ has gone up about 1 point per generation, although that seems to have plateaued to an extent. And also that if I think of, say, people in my grandparents' generation, they seem much less inclined to have conversations like the ones we're having right now. That is, people who perhaps did not experience the fruits of capitalism at the stage to which it has subsequently advanced. So I think that that's a rather silly view on the part of Chomsky.
I would say that one of the problems with the Marxist critique is that the iron law of wages that Marx used to argue that the working class would constantly become poor was, I think, dealt a definitive defeat by Mises when he basically pointed out the fact that men aren't animals. Men don't consume just what they don't produce just what they need to live, and they don't consume just what they need to live. And of course, if you don't pay your workers enough wages, they can't buy the products you're making. And I think also that there's a danger of making the mistake that a certain negative effect of a system is inevitably the result of that system rather than some historic context. So for example, yeah, in many ways, the mills in England called the Satanic Mills were pretty terrible. But again, on the one hand, compared to what? Well, farming before then was no walk in the park. And second of all, afterwards, there were reforms that were made. Now, you might argue, well, that was just to stave off a socialist revolution. Maybe, but the fact is they were still made. And the system was, so for example, Murray Bookchin, before he died, pointed out that the collapse theories of capitalism had all failed. The capitalism was not only decrepit and dying, but dynamic, robust, and growing too rapidly. And he pointed out that there really isn't any contemporary socialist critique of capitalism's inevitable collapse that will work, because they've all been tried and failed. This makes me think of that ridiculous line where Trotsky said that in communism, every man will be a Marx, and Aristotle and a Goethe. And it's like, actually, communism makes man as stupid as it's possible for man to become. Because you have to also ask yourself, what do they offer instead, in replace of the division of labor, capitalist prices, and all of these things. And there is the fact that, in many ways, I think socialists and their track record of predicting the collapse of capitalism have a lot in common with Christian fundamentalists trying to predict the second coming of Jesus Christ. They're both wrong all the time. And in a lot of ways, I think that's one of the biggest impediments to taking this objection seriously. Now, where I could maybe meet the Marxists halfway is that certain forms of regimentation and production are dehumanizing. But then that just begs the question, because the Marxist societies are even more regimented and therefore even more dehumanizing than the capitalist mode of production. I mean, would you rather work for Walmart, where at least you can quit, or work for the Soviet state, where you're not even allowed to unionize? It's not at all self-evident in that regard. Looks like we have Swithin back. Can you hear us, Swithin? Maybe he can't. Can you hear us, Swithin? Okay. I guess Keith Preston, do you have any comments you'd like to add to what was been mentioned thus far?
Well, when it comes to the Marxist critique of classical 19th century capitalism, we have to remember that what he was writing about was not capitalism as it has been experienced since then. He was talking about a particular model of capitalism, which was the early industrial model. And that's the kind of capitalism that still exists in certain parts of the world. If you look at countries around the world that are typically labeled as newly industrializing or something like that, the model of capitalism that is practiced there is fairly similar to what Karl Marx was writing about. An ironic example would be China. If you go and you look at working conditions and environmental conditions and political conditions in China, which you often see, ironically, given that China is supposed to be a communist nation, what you actually see there is 19th century capitalism. However, I think that Marx was actually right when he predicted that capitalism, as it was understood during his time, would collapse eventually, because it did. It collapsed during the 1920s and 1930s under the period of the Great Depression. There's a really important work about this that was published back in the 1930s called the Managerial Revolution by James Burnham. James Burnham was a former Trotskyite who became a kind of conservative Machiavellian. He was influenced by the Italian elite theorists like Pareto and some of those. But what he argued in the Managerial Revolution, and I think he was basing his work in part on some previous thinkers like Lawrence Dennis and Max Nomad and some others, but what he argued was that a new form of capitalism had developed during the 1930s, during the Great Depression era, that it was no longer the classical 19th century Gilded Age bourgeois capitalism. It was a new kind of managerial capitalism. And he argued this by pointing to all the different kinds of economic systems that were coming into place in the industrialized world at the time. He looked at the United States, at the countries of Western Europe, at Nazi Germany, which was around at the time, fascist Italy, the Soviet Union, Imperial Japan. He looked at all of those major powers that eventually had it out in World War II. And he said, if you look at all of these, what they have done is create a modified type of capitalism. They've created a type of capitalism that is not classical bourgeois capitalism. It's a system that's run by the state. They may retain markets and they may retain private property to varying degrees. England and America remained closer to classical capitalism than some of these other places. The Soviet Union went for full collectivism, but these were new kinds of industrial societies in which the state played a much more central role and were much more collective societies. And I tend to think that Marx was right in that sense. Marx was right in the sense that the classical 19th century model of capitalism did eventually collapse. And it was replaced, ironically, by the kind of more collectivist societies that Marx himself envisioned. Now, it wasn't the kind of extreme utopianism that 19th century socialists tended to write about. If you go back and you read some of those people, they had some really far out ideas that sounded like science fiction, even by today's standards. Like Fourier, the early socialist, argued that you would have communes in the future where they had rivers made of lemonade and stuff like that. It was something like, it really was science fiction. Nothing like that has come into being, although some of the technology we have now would seem like science fiction to people in the 19th century. So capitalism was replaced by, classical capitalism was replaced by a new kind of collective capitalism. Now, what's happened in contemporary times, in the era of globalization or whatever, is that yet another model of capitalism has started to develop, neoliberalism. And neoliberalism has also developed many of the same problems that classical capitalism had in terms of the dangers of overconcentration of wealth, overproduction, underconsumption, and some huge disparities between social classes. And we're already starting to see some of the same kind of civil unrest that was generated by classical capitalism. So I don't know that the Marxist critique in that sense is actually wrong. Where I do think it's wrong, though, where I do think the classical Marxist critique is wrong, is that the working class, so-called, has not become increasingly immiserated as a result of capitalism. If we actually go back and look at world data going back for the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution began, what we see is that life expectancy worldwide has increased. We've seen that health standards have increased significantly. We've also seen that literacy rates have increased. Literacy rates worldwide are probably at an all-time high at this point. So the level of basic education that people achieve is now greater than ever before. Now, I think a parallel argument or counter argument that could be made to that is that the cost of mass education, that is raising the literacy and education standards of the masses, has come at the cost of dumbing down the elite, in the sense that as education has become much more available and consumed by much more people, the quality of it has gone down. If you compared, say, the kind of education you would get at Harvard today versus the education you would get at Harvard in, say, 100 years ago, I think that you would rationally have to say that the quality of the education you got at Harvard 100 years ago was better. While education has been dumbed down, it's also been made more available on a much wider level. So I guess it's been a double-edged sword in that sense. But in that sense, though, the condition of the masses, or the working class, whatever, has actually been uplifted considerably since the 19th century. Certainly in the developed countries, starting in the mid-19th century, in the mid-20th century, rather, the working class in developed countries began to live like an upper middle class, and even had luxuries that an upper middle class, or even an upper class in previous time wouldn't have had, like automobiles and washing machines and microwave ovens and stuff like that. And we're starting to see the creation of middle classes and all of that in other societies in other parts of the world now, where that kind of rapid development is taking place, like in China and East Asia and all of that. So I think the Marxist critique was in many ways correct, but at the same time, it didn't account for many of these developments that have happened since then.
Okay, Swithin, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. Now we're waiting for the NCAP response to all this.
Oh, okay. So what I was going to say was, my understanding of the basic arguments as to why capitalism has internal contradictions, according to Marx, is the idea that it's based firstly around the labour theory of value, and that there is a certain amount of value which is created via labour in the production of things, and the wages of the labourer is pushed down by the capitalist until subsistence. And so over and above that is surplus value, which is taken by the capitalist class. And so when you have a greater amount of surplus value, the problem is because you're paying your workers so little, that they can't afford to buy them. So you have to export them to overseas countries or other non-capitalist countries. Otherwise, what you do is you have a general glut of production, and then you have a crisis, because the only reason the capitalists will buy luxury goods over and above subsistence, but they can only buy so much until the only reason they invest is for turning a profit. And so effectively you have a collapse in demand, and then you have mass unemployment. That's my basic understanding of why there are the internal contradictions under capitalism, which is just very bad economics. I mean, if it was the case, well, leaving aside the labour theory of value, suppose it was the case that you had a big collapse in demand, well, why don't prices go down? And then the purchasing power of the proletariat increases such that they can then purchase these products. Then, of course, there's the labour theory of value and surplus value. I've never heard a convincing or even a coherent argument as to why labour theory of value is true in explaining prices of goods on the market. The closest I have ever got is basically that in general equilibrium, where effectively all entrepreneurs don't make any errors and there is no profits in a pure economic sense. If there was no land monopoly or money monopoly, the proportion of rent would be relatively lower in cost, as would interest. And so it'd be primarily just then, therefore, be wages. Therefore, the predominant cause of the value is labour. But that doesn't follow at all. All it merely says is that, well, they're going to break even in general equilibrium. And you can equally interpret that as saying that entrepreneurs will bid up the factors of production until how much money they effectively generate for you. So even if that was true, it doesn't actually explain that labour is the source of value, because that argument is equally consistent with the subjectivist theory that the entrepreneur will bid up the factors of production until it's the technical term, the discounted marginal value, marginal revenue product. Sorry. So the essential critique of capitalism by the Marxists on the purely economic angle is completely nonsensical. That said, there are crises in the capitalist system which I think are much better explained by fractional reserve banking and central banking in general. So whilst I think he highlights a problem within the current sort of capitalist system, it's not due to the inherent structure as such of wage labour or concentration of capital as such. It's rather the banking and the banking sector, but primarily the Austrian business cycle theory, which I could go into another point if anyone was interested. So yeah, that angle of critique is wrong. Secondly, you originally mentioned before I had major technical problems, that Smith said that the division of labor would make everybody stupid. Yes, that's possible if you had a situation where it was worthwhile just to put everybody onto a huge production line and everybody to have the smallest job to do. But I think the reality is there's only so much increased productivity you can get from that before you get to use demotivation for the workforce. This is what lots of managerial theorists discuss in the early 20th century, was how to motivate workers in these areas. So I don't see that as necessarily being economic. And secondly, if it was the case that you had significantly lower barriers to entry, etc., although you could argue this isn't capitalism as it has become, which would be a fair comment, then the extent of the division of labour would be undertaken under conditions where the individual labourer had more bargaining power, and smaller firms within sort of the nexus of exchange and specialisation would mean that you could still have relatively skilled work, and yeah, that the fact that you continue to specialise doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a completely dumbed down population. That's only true if the only form of specialisation which can take place is within an existing production process in a factory. So on both counts, Marx is wrong.
Okay, and you made an interesting point, the idea that the only kind of specialized labor would be in a factory. So for example, a scientist, a university professor essentially does highly specialized repetitive work, but I don't think they would argue it's anywhere near as mind-numbing as a role on a factory line. And as we move into an information economy, where, though granted, I have said that I think coding is the new assembly line and does dull the senses if you do it long enough. There are people that apparently like it, and so they do that too. And so it's not entirely self-evident that all forms of specialization are such that it makes people stupid. Right, Ruminations, do you have anything you want to add to this?
Well, I think that one of the problems with the Marxist historical view of this situation is that it is, as Keith had alluded to earlier, oddly conservative in some ways. Reading the Communist Manifesto, it's not entirely clear to me what Marx's actual attitude is towards capitalism in relation to what came before it. Because while he does seem to view it as a force of progress in some respects, he seems to have this vituperative hatred for it that really does almost sound like something you hear coming from a high Tory or something like that. And as Ralph Raico has pointed out, this all rests on the time-honored misconception that indeed the circumstances, the material circumstances of the working class have become worse since the Industrial Revolution, when in fact the serious scholars of that issue, even the ones who are hesitant to emphasize it, have essentially come to a unanimous agreement that that was in fact not the case. And it reminds me of an anecdote that Henry Hazlitt related about this woman of the gentry in the south of England who was basically on board with the Marxist critique of Victorian capitalism and thought, well, you have all of these people living in these cities. They are oppressed by working in heavy industry and so forth, until she actually encountered some people and was deeply embarrassed to find that they were living in much better conditions than indeed the people who were working for her in the countryside. Now, in keeping with this, it is worth pointing out that when the great example of a Marxist revolt against capitalism was not really in a quintessentially developed capitalist country, but rather in Russia, which was a kind of reactionary society that I think decidedly had certain pre-capitalist traits, and in that way was kind of the opposite of a vindication of the theory. My ultimate view of this assertion that there are internal contradictions in capitalism is that it's not even primarily bad economics, it's bad historiography, because they're starting with the outcome. They're starting with the view that there are these internal contradictions in capitalism based on economics, but every time the collapse of capitalism is delayed, the theory has to be updated. So at first, kind of the original excuse beginning with Marx was that, well, the reason that perhaps these revolutions have not taken place yet is because we have not yet advanced to the stage of late stage or third stage capitalism. So we what will have to happen is that the state will become involved in propping up capitalism, and only once it kind of hits a breaking point beyond that will we reach a revolutionary breaking point. Though the problem with this, of course, is that the earlier and more rapidly developing capitalist economies in Marx's time, namely France and England, were relatively laissez-faire compared to America and Germany, which were the more kind of state-controlled capitalism that Marx was identifying as late-stage capitalism. And then the next big update was with Lenin, who then had claimed that capitalism was prolonging its lifespan on the basis of imperialism, and so that therefore the actual revolution would have to take place in Russia, and that Russia would then serve as a kind of placeholder for the real revolution, which would take place in a more advanced society as per Marxist predictions. The problem is that then the working class did not revolt in Western countries because their circumstances were simply too good and the internal contradictions were not in place. So the next big update was, of course, Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno, who came in and said, well, it's enculturation. That's the problem. It's not the internal contradictions. It's not necessarily the economic incongruencies. It is rather enculturation that is the problem, and that is preventing things from reaching this breaking point. But of course, the problem is that deculturalized man in the late modern world, that is the man of social justice, as it were, is even less likely to part with the material comforts of capitalism than was the bourgeois man. And so it seems to me that they've just discarded historiography altogether at this point and just decided to talk about things like the environment or some reason that we need to advance socialism. Now, that being said, there is something to the view that capitalism has an internal contradiction, which does lead to a kind of socialism, but it is not Marxist revolutionary socialism that is addressing disparities in what the workers receive versus what is due to them, but rather that capitalism, as Joseph Schumpeter has pointed out, has made people so prosperous that they have the sufficient leisure time and sense of entitlement to then basically go on and devise economic systems or demand economic systems, which are probably more approximate of something like welfare state capitalism. So in a sense, I guess, capitalism does inevitably lead to socialism, but it's not really Marxist socialism. It's something different.
Yeah, Swithin, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Not so much, except I think the Marxist critique, I suppose, yes, it does start from, there are these problems in capitalism, except I would say that without its economics, Marxism doesn't really exist. And so if you don't have the economic critique, it's not really Marxism in that way. So I suppose I would make the case similar to Paul Gottfried, that sort of Adorno, etc., from the Frankfurt School onwards, even though they are Marxists of a sort, they aren't really Marxist, because the true sort of Marxian point of view is the economic materialist angle. So yes, and I think I'd agree with Right Ruminations that if the contradiction that might exist, though I don't think it does necessarily, that people become wealthier, although some don't, obviously. Well, they do, but the disparity become greater under capitalism. They can then lobby for welfare state capitalism. I think is probably a more realistic change to the economic system than, say, than this sort of proletarian revolution bringing in socialism. And I suppose as well, thinking about that, the idea that you're going to have some sort of ground-up revolution under Marxism isn't really very consistent with any sort of general revolutionary pattern in history. It's normally the upper middle class who are the revolutionary class in most cases to overthrow the people who are one rung above them. So the idea that you're going to get, because I mean, Marx was basically at the time a upper middle class kind of guy who just really didn't like who was on top of him, and so created a theory to overthrow them. I think something like the change in the economic system in the 20th century, advocated like something like James Burnham, was probably more accurate, that you have the managerial class have the control of the means of production, and that increases their power, and then you end up with this sort of managerial state, moving away from sort of like the classic capitalist state in the 19th century. I think that sort of move of the economic system is much more realistic than a ground-up sort of proletarian revolution ever would be.
Okay, Keith.
Well, I generally agree with most of what Right Ruminations and Swithun have said so far. I think one issue with Marxism is that one of its weaknesses is that it underestimated how dynamic capitalism or the market economy, or whatever you want to call it, would turn out to be. Marx, as I said earlier, his critique of capitalism is based on a particular model of capitalism that existed in the 19th century. But what we've seen since then is the consistent modification or reinvention of capitalism, in the sense that capitalism essentially takes on new forms over time. It's still capitalism in the sense that you still have markets, you still have profits, you still have private property, you still have exchange value, you still have all these kinds of things that are the primary features of capitalism that certainly a Marxist would identify as a feature of capitalism. But it takes on these consistent new forms over time. One was, as I mentioned, and as Swithun mentioned as well, the managerial revolution. But interestingly, though, if we want to look at what the right calls cultural Marxism, which is the ideas that are derived from the Frankfurt School and all of that, Marcuse and all of that stuff. In some ways, we could relate that to Marxist theory, in the sense that saying, well, Marx had this idea that capitalism was necessary for the achievement of socialism, because capitalism was necessary to achieve the level of wealth and technology and industrial production and all of that would make socialism possible. He thought capitalism was a necessary transitional phase. And to some degree that has happened. As was said earlier, the advanced capitalist societies have over time been transformed into managerial capitalism, a more state-directed capitalism, and also the welfare state, which is not classical socialism. It's not, the a planned economy with based on to each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs, and it's not, Fourier's idea of rivers full of lemonade and these kinds of far-fetched utopia. But you do have a much more collective form of capitalism that does have socialistic features like the welfare state and social security and compulsory maternity leave and all these kinds of things that would have been unheard of in the 19th century. And not only that, but capitalism also created the wealth that made cultural Marxism, which I agree is not a good term. It's not a good term to call the cultural left cultural Marxists, because they're not Marxist in the sense of basing their theoretical foundation on the class struggle. They're something else, maybe neo-Marxist at the best, and even that is pushing it a bit. I tend to agree with Paul Gottfried on that as well. But the level of affluence and wealth that was achieved by historic capitalism in advanced countries, in my view, is what made the cultural left in its modern form possible. Because it was only in advanced capitalist societies like the kinds that emerged in the post-World War II era that the cultural left started to become predominant. If we go back and look at the pre-World War II left in the Western world, even in the most developed countries like England and America, we see that the left was mostly concerned about material conditions, bread and butter issues, union issues, labor issues, social security, these kinds of things. By the middle to late part of the 20th century, by the 1950s, 1960s, in that time period, all of that was more or less taken for granted. And instead, the political left started to move towards things like liberation, like cultural liberation. Well, let's focus less on material and bread and butter issues. Let's focus on civil rights and racism or whatever. Or let's focus on gender equality. Or let's focus on gay liberation or environmentalism. And then it keeps on expanding into, say, transgenderism and animal rights and on and on and on. But those kinds of things were emerged only after a certain level of material wealth was produced that made concerns about those kinds of things or interest in that kind of thing feasible. Nobody cares about any of that in a society where people don't have food, they don't have shelter from the basic elements, they don't have basic medicine. Nobody's worried about that in a society that's overrun with tuberculosis and malaria and things like that. So in that sense, I think in a very loose sense, the Marxist idea of, well, all right, capitalism is going to collapse, or capitalism has to generate a certain level of wealth in order to produce socialism. And on a sufficiently abstract, sufficiently vague sense, that kind of intuitive Marxism is perhaps somewhat insightful in the sense that capitalism did, in the 19th century model of capitalism did collapse in the Great Depression. It was reinvented as this kind of collectivist capitalism and welfare capitalism, which you could argue is a vague form of socialism. And then in turn, that created the foundation, the cultural foundation for the modern cultural left, with its emphasis on personal liberation and the personal is political and all of that kind of stuff. You can only have that with a certain level of material wealth and economic and technological development. So in that very, very loose sense, I think the Marxist outlook turned out to be somewhat insightful, albeit not in the ways that they really predicted. It's also interesting how the Leninist idea or the Maoist revision of Marxism has this idea where they say, well, what happened? Why was there no workers' revolution or whatever in the developed countries? Well, it was because the workers' standards of living developed to the point they didn't really care to have a revolution, which was true. I mean, unless you count the rise of the labor movement, unless you count the militant strikes and stuff like that happened during the Depression era. If you count that as a workers' revolution, quote unquote, then maybe so. But it certainly wasn't what the Marxists envisioned. But then you have this idea, well, the system of exploitation has been transferred to developing countries, right? But you actually start to see that falling apart in the late 20th century, in the post-colonial period. You start to see those the colonies start to become decolonized. Now, of course, this is what the Marxists call neocolonialism. But as the colonies were decolonized, then you start seeing this also yet another reinvention of of Marxism with this emphasis on cultural liberation, to the point where today most people who are on the hard left in the developed world, in the the most developed parts of the world, that's really all they care about. It's all they're really interested in is this kind of identity oriented stuff, this kind of the race, gender, everything is racist, everything is sexist, everything is homophobic. That's really their entire emphasis. There's very limited emphasis on the label theory of value, if they even know what that is, or there's very limited emphasis on the welfare state, beyond, say, in America that we need single payer or whatever. It really is this kind of cultural outlook, which is made possible by an affluent society.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that sort of gets at this is the tanky YouTuber Jason Unruh, Miles Rebel News, basically sort of takes a third positionist perspective. He argues that since the standard of living is so high in the first world, you can't have any radicalized proletariat. Everybody's essentially bought off to some degree or other. But third worldism is essentially a self-defeating principle, because as the standard of living of the world rises due to globalism, there won't be a third world at all, unless it's some sort of tin pot dictatorship which fails to develop adequately. But that isn't striking back at capitalism. That's just retreating in the face of capitalism to try to reorganize. And it does seem that the increasing material productivity of capitalism has allowed for a resiliency against socialist revolutionary struggle that we don't see before. And again, to quote Bookchin, capitalist collapse theories have all failed. Capitalism is not on its last legs, but arguably growing exponentially. Now, I mean, obviously, you telescope something out long enough, and it probably will fail. I mean, feudalism failed. The Roman imperial project failed. So I suppose in some distant future, we could envision capitalism failing, like any human construction. But it's unlikely that it would be based on the contradictions or problems pointed out by Marxists. Swithin, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Oh, all I was thinking was, yes, it's not really a very Marxist view, but I suppose one of the arguments that some might make as to why capitalism would collapse is from the neo-eugenicists, because of the development of modern medical technology. Children who otherwise would have died don't, and so you have the children of the less intelligent surviving, who have people who have relatively worse genetic disposition for illness, etc. So what you'd expect is over time, and plus the reduced birth rates of the upper middle classes. And so what you'll have over time is a reduction of average IQ levels, and you might get to the tipping point where you can no longer maintain the technological infrastructure that you have already created. They'll point to things like, I think the only argument was per capita innovation rates are down to sort of early 17th or late 16th century levels. So the rate of technological development is going down relative, or the pace of it in certain respects. Whether I buy all that's another question. But that is kind of taking the well, I suppose it links quite nicely in sort of like the decadent, sort of the rightist decadent critique of current economic and social systems, and so you're right for some form of collapse. But as you say, this is very much away from the classic sort of Marxist critique of capitalism.
All right, I think we'll start with closing statements. We'll begin with you, Ruminations.
Well, I think that just following with what Swithin had said, the ironic thing is that there are actually plenty of decent arguments to make against capitalism, but all of them, it seems to me, involve the fact that capitalism is too good. that its internal contradictions, insofar as they do exist, say with the neo-eugenicist argument, is that it provides too well for the less valuable elements of society, and therefore might have some kind of contradiction. That remains to be seen. Richard Lynn's word on the situation is that as far as they can tell, IQs have basically remained about steady on average since the 90s, so we won't know until we have hindsight on that. To address something that was said earlier about cultural Marxism, my intention was not to imply that cultural Marxism has not run away from original Marxism, or to really in any way contradict what Paul Gottfried has to say about it, but rather to just put in perspective the cultural Marxist phenomenon as a part of Marxist historiography updating itself in order to account for why the internal contradictions haven't manifested themselves. So I'm not saying that cultural Marxism is classical Marxism, but I'm saying that it had its motivation in large part to try to vindicate certain aspects of classical Marxist historiography by saying, well, here's why these predictions have not panned out. And the final thing I would like to say is to just emphasize once again the sloppiness of the scholarship involved in this, by comparison with the greatest punching bag in modern historical academia, which is the Whig interpretation of history. That is, when you apply this idea of like a dialectical Hegelianism, where things become better over time and they point towards some historical end, well, that is the laughingstock in all other forms of history other than Marxist historiography. Every undergraduate English course starts with, here is why none of us take seriously the Whig interpretation of history, because it's based on this silly Hegelian idea of kind of historical teleology. Why is it that the Marxists still have a respectable place in academia when their entire model is analogous to the Whig interpretation of history, and they have constantly had to update it in order to provide reasons as to why its predictions have not proven true? So if this then that, if the Whig school of history is not allowed in academia, I do not understand why Marxism as a form of historiography is still respected.
Yes, Keith Preston, final thoughts.
Well, I think that if capitalism were to end at some point in the future, as you say, Todd, it could be that capitalism will eventually come to an end in the same way that feudalism did after a millennia of existence or so. I don't think that class conflict per se will really be the real reason why capitalism eventually disappears. I think it's more likely to be something that Ted Kaczynski would probably agree with, and that is some combination or one or the other when it comes to either technological or environmental factors. That is, I think technological development could become such that capitalism simply becomes obsolete. For instance, you have these people today who talk about terms like, I think it's fully automated luxury communism or something like that. And the idea is that the technology is going to become so advanced and so developed that machines can essentially produce things on their own, and all human beings really have to do is consume. Machines can build themselves, machines can repair themselves, machines can maintain themselves, or they can maintain other machines. You have a machine to maintain a machine to maintain a machine. So within this kind of framework, if you had technological development on that level, then yes, I suppose you could have the kind of from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs type of full communism that the Marxists say is their end game or the end of history or whatever. And in fact, when it comes to consumer goods, you could even have technology that developed to the point where you could produce any kind of consumer goods you wanted synthetically. If you want bananas, you just create, synthetic bananas with a computer program or something. So that's one way I could see capitalism eventually becoming obsolete. The other one would be the other direction. And that is, if the environmental doomsday people turn out to be correct, and there's a major ecological collapse that results in a technological regression, not the kind of massive technological expansion that I just described, but a massive technological regression in the other way, where something happens to capitalism like what happened to the Western Roman Empire, where we have technological regression to such a point that we are basically living in a pre-modern, largely pre-industrial, pre-capitalist society. We're going back to something more like, if not feudalism, agrarianism or something of that kind, or production models based on subsistence rather than commodification. So I think those two variables, technology and the environment, really are going to be what determines the future of capitalism rather than class conflict.
Okay, Swithin, last word.
The Marxist, I think, is make clear, the Marxist critique of capitalism as such is in gross error. While I said that the Marxists, the neo-Marxists, as you could call them, Mark User, etc., weren't really Marxist with their critique of sort of society, I suppose it is a Marxist critique, at least insofar as it's based on an oppressor-oppressed narrative, where in the classical Marxist one, you had the capitalist class exploiting the proletariat. Although outside that sort of specific situation, or a classic sort of anarchist ruling class narrative, it becomes so unmoored from anything that it just ends up being the whole world is just permanent sort of power, oppressor in sort of all aspects. And so we always move back, at least in the cultural left, the oppressed, but you've never really, there's no real logical end to this. It will just constantly be self-negating, effectively. But with respect to the general economic structure, I think Keith is right. I think if you get to a sort of post sort of scarcity situation, then yeah, capitalism could sort of alter. That said, of course, with our sort of critiques of neoliberalism, with a significantly different sort of legal framework and cultural norms, I mean, the current manifestation of how sort of capitalism operates may be significantly different, where you could have independent workers with their reasonable ownership of capital themselves, rather than capital being concentrated in sort of major corporations.
All right, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.